Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, we're dealing with actual Greenbelt policies as opposed to boundaries and the like, GB1 to GB4 and SS2. I've seen the representations, obviously, and read all the hearing statements, but I've been made aware that the council perhaps has had another look at these, given the submissions that have been made. And I think it'd be good to start off, Mr. Lynas, with a run-through.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Perhaps the easiest thing to do is actually to hand out in a written form, given the number of people that are here. Now, sir, what you have typed there needs to be seen in the context of the modifications that were included in Appendix 1 to the hearing statement, because they effectively tell you what you need to do with the text in that appendix. But in short, we've reflected on the representations that have been received. And if I can summarise in this way, is that we were overcomplicating in our policies matters which are set out clearly in national policy. We had already sought to clarify the policy in the proposed modifications in the hearing statement, but as we revisited those in preparation for this afternoon's session, we took the view that greater clarity could be provided. So what we broadly propose now is that there is a single policy, GB1, on development in the Greenbelt, which essentially translates national policy into a catch-all policy dealing with all aspects of development in the Greenbelt. That would allow the deletion of policies GB2 and GB3, which in their original form covers specific aspects of potential not inappropriate development that are covered in any event in GB1. And when we looked through those policies, we took the view that they didn't add anything material to the test that were going to be either in GB1 in any event, or which would have to be satisfied through other policies in the plan. So we thought that it would be easier and neater to delete those policies, subject to bringing in aspects of the supporting text, for example, on infilling under GB2, where that was now going to be relevant to the consolidated policy under GB1. I should say that the text also refers under GB1 to the deletion of some other supporting text, but I'll come back to that. As far as GB1 itself is concerned, that is essentially a translation of policy that, I should be clear, is drawn from the 2021 NPPF. Now, when we were thinking about how to make this simple, it essentially resolved into sort of three different options. One, you have a policy that says we will determine Greenbelt applications in accordance with national policy, like the Hamilton example. Now, on reflection, whatever happens with local plans down the line, to some extent you could do that with many policies in the plan. We thought we'd defeat the purpose of having a local plan, particularly one where Greenbelt boundaries are being set for the first time, to simply have such a brief policy. The second option would simply be to translate it according to the 2012 NPPF, but notwithstanding this is a transitional arrangements plan, we thought that this isn't in the same category as assessments such as housing need and so on. This is a direct, specific DM policy, and we might as well be pragmatic and recognise the reality that in this limited example, you're going to be having applications which would inevitably have regard to this specific aspect of policy under 2021 NPPF. So we had thought you could put in the 2012 wording with a rider that says unless altered by national policy to cover that, if you were strictly concerned about adhering in every single policy in the plan to the transitional arrangements. On balance, we thought the preferable approach was to translate the requirements of the 2021 MPF because, as I said, this is a highly specific, limited approach which doesn't affect the broader transitional arrangements that are being applied to the rest of the plan. So essentially, that is what GB1 does, with some minor tweaks to the wording. So, for example, where the national policy refers to the local planning authority area, we will say the council area. And where there's reference to limited affordable housing for local community needs, under, we say in the draft policy GB, which would be now, that would be renumbered, what is currently GB4. That reflects the specific circumstances of this plan, rather than having the general reference to policies in the development plan that's in the 2021 MPPF. That's the broad scheme of GB1. As I've said, the supporting text would essentially remain the same. We're proposing that we delete the last sentence of 1014, which, if you turn to the Appendix 1 to the hearing statement, one can see that the last sentence of 1014 says it's acknowledged that in special circumstances park and ride sites may be located within the green belt. We're proposing the deletion because when you look at the policy, there is provision for development to not be regarded as inappropriate where it is local transport infrastructure which can demonstrate a requirement for a green belt location. So we thought it was better in circumstances where a park and ride site may not be inappropriate to delete any suggestion from 1014 that were automatically in very special circumstances. The other aspect of the supporting text is that we're proposing to bring forward text which is currently in 1018 under GB2 relating to infilling. We thought that was appropriate because it gives a little bit more guidance on the approach that the Council proposes to infilling. We don't think that needs to go in to the main body of the policy, but given that infilling is referred to under GB1 as now proposed to be drafted, we thought that would be useful text to put into the supporting text there. The only other point on GB1 is that you'll see from the last sentence of the proposed redrafting is that we've confirmed that where proposals for development are not inappropriate, that they'll still be subject to other policies in the plan. And again, that is a neater way of achieving the approach to not inappropriate development than having the specific policies that we've identified. As for other proposed amendments, GB4 is the rural exception sites policy, sir, and I understand that previous hearing sessions, the Council accepted that it should delete current paragraph 10.25, which related to affordable housing sites for gypsies and travellers, and that was considered during the Gypsy and Travellers session. That has not been followed through into the drafting of Appendix 1 to the hearing statement. We just need to tidy that up in the main mods. As for policy SS2, I think some points were raised about the second paragraph in particular of the policy and its reference to the general extent of the green belt on the key diagram. I think and there's also reference in the second sentence of that policy to the boundaries shown on the policies map. On reflection, we think that given the green belt policies are essentially going to be determined by reference to the boundaries as shown on the proposals map, the clearer thing to do is to simply say in the second paragraph that green belt boundaries are shown on the proposals map. And we didn't think it was necessary to refer to how the policies map shows readily recognisable physical features that are likely to endure, because the boundaries are what they are, and you'd see them on the map in any event. So we'd propose amendments to the second paragraph to deal with that point. So that, in short, is how we propose to deal with modifications. We accept entirely that they will need to be followed through into the form and format of modifications, but we hope that as proposed they deal with a number of the criticisms that were made about the policy as it stood.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. That's most helpful and probably has certainly cut down on my list of questions that I prepared. Does anyone have anything to say about this? Who'd like to start the conversation off? Have you had Mr. Keogh? Then go on. I recognise you've only just seen these, but given that they follow the line of national policy, I don't think there's too much of a surprise in there. But go on, Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. No, I think these are welcome modifications and changes. I think they're in line with the comments that have been made by ourselves and others. And again, I fully support the aim of using the text from the 2021 NPPF, because that, of course, is the criteria against which the applications will be judged. So in that respect, I think these amendments are welcome in terms of the simplification they bring to the policy and to the plan, and to a slight shortening of the plan, which is always welcome. On the face of it, from what I've read so far, I'd agree with these modifications. Yeah, thank you.
It's very helpful, Mr. Keogh. Go on.
Thank you. Likewise, I welcome the I welcome the changes and welcome the approach on which MPP have to follow. One really minor point, paragraph 1012, in that first paragraph, I think, sorry, this is in the amended version in the Appendix 1, only that paragraph, that first sentence might need to be altered slightly to reflect G, second bullet point in the policy.
That's understood. I think what we'll need to do in finalising the main mod, which can obviously be subject to comment anyway, we will double check whether any of the glitches, if I can call them that, in the original version were followed through into supporting text to see if they need to be tightened. But we can do that to make sure there's a match up between the supporting text and the wording of the policy. That's understood.
Thank you.
I'll take a note of that.
Mr. Pilcher?
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I was a couple of minutes late, I think. I agree again with what Mr. Keogh says, that it seems very reasonable for the future plan to accord with at least where we are up to on the national planning policy framework, because that's what it's going to be policed against. So it seems perfectly reasonable. In fact, that was going to be one of my points relating to GB4 specifically, is about the idea that we quickly come to 5-year reviews, and I mean, I'm not sure if that is due in March 23 or whether we start 5 years from when we potentially get a plan adopted maybe. But immediately one of the comments was going to be that we're going to come straight back to what's the current framework and say, well, actually, you know, paragraph 146F says blah, blah, blah. So I think that seems perfectly reasonable. And any opportunity to get rid of reference to the key diagram will be welcomed by anyone who's been connected to York for the last 31 years, because that's been a fairly useless key diagram for a long time. Thank you, sir. Do you want to come back to any other policies, or do you want anyone to comment on anything else relating to GB4 or any other things? Yeah, I'll let Eamon go.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I was just covering GB 1 to 3 there. I do have some more comments on GB4. I don't know whether you want to ask them. Well, so again, I would just reiterate the points that we've made in our written representations, in that particularly in relation to criteria 1 and criteria 3 and 4. So my main beef, as it were, with policy GB4 is that, as you've seen from our evidence, that to date there's been very few exception sites approved within York. Lots of the surrounding authorities have made significant progress in achieving affordable housing completions on exception sites in their areas. And I think one of the problems in York has been the complexity and the additional restrictions in this policy that it imposes above and beyond national policy. I'm happy to see that one of the changes we suggested has been heeded, which is the removing the has to be within 800 metres of an existing defined settlement limit. But the other one, I suppose one of my main points is that in criteria 1, again, I welcome the inclusion of that the development contributes to meeting identified local affordable housing need. But as illustrated by an up-to-date housing needs assessment, I think that's a very high bar for a lot of particularly small developers and people who may be trying to bring forward small sites. Carrying out an affordable housing needs assessment can be a complex and lengthy undertaking. The existing housing needs assessment, of course, is, if I'm right, still in 2016 housing needs assessment. So that's all we've got to go on. And you can see the complexity there is embodied within that document. And I think requiring every scheme for an exception site to have an up-to-date housing needs assessment is a high bar. I think the change that has been introduced, that it's simply meeting identified local affordable housing need, is enough. Because again, parish councils and local developers and local housing associations will often be able to identify local housing needs which may not be picked up within housing needs assessment. The other changes, so I've asked that criteria 3 and 4 be deleted because, well, I think part of the objection to criteria 3 has been answered with the proposed change. But again, I think criteria 4 is probably covered by other development control policies within the plan in terms of design of new developments. And then finally, sir, my point in relation to the last bullet point of the policy referring to reasonable land values. Again, I think that's an issue that is covered by guidance on viability assessment. And I think introducing the criteria of reasonable land values within this policy again raises something which is already, as I say, is already covered elsewhere within national guidance.
Thank you, Mr. Keogh. Do you want to deal with those, Mr. Linus?
Yes, thank you, sir. Yes, we would resist any suggestion that one should delete the requirement for an up-to-date housing needs assessment. We bear in mind that when one looks at the MPPF, the provision for rural exception sites in the context of Greenbelt policy refers to limited affordable housing for local community needs under policy set out in the local plan. That's paragraph 89, the penultimate bullet point. And that's still reflected in the latest NPPF. And one must bear in mind that the concept in any event of a rural exception site it is one where permission is being granted contrary to normal development control policies. So the rationale for it is that it does have a specific justification, which is addressing the affordable housing needs of local communities. And if that is to be the basis of the policy, we say it's entirely reasonable to require an up-to-date housing needs assessment, which is more specific to the local area where the need is alleged to arise and to justify the rural exception site coming forward. So we would resist any suggestion that that should be excluded from the policy.
Do I take from that then that what you're not asking for in that policy is a housing needs assessment that would cover the whole of the council area? It would be something more localised?
Yes, I think that's the intention, because if it's related to local community needs, and it's a rural exception site, one would anticipate that the needs that are going to be delivered are not going to be those which would be applied across the local area as a whole. I think the idea is that there's flexibility retained in the policy to allow for the local needs to be addressed, to be determined on an application by application basis. But I suspect the rationale behind the policy is to be looking at something which is more focused than simply an area-wide need.
As modified, it talks about a local affordable housing need,
Yes.
as illustrated by an up-to-date housing needs assessment. So that you can take from that the housing needs assessment would have to be localised because it's to show local affordable housing need.
Yes, and if one looks at the PPG on meeting housing needs of different groups and rural exception sites, it says that they should seek to address the affordable housing needs of local communities, which seems to strike at the same objective, sir.
Mr. Keogh.
Yes, sir. I could go along with that. I think I can accept that explanation, but the policy, what happens is, of course, down the line, different officers can have different interpretations of the policy. I think what could be helpful here is if that reference to an up-to-date housing needs assessment, if that clarification to reflecting the local housing needs of the area in which the exception site is located could be put into supporting text. That would actually clarify the matter fully. And therefore there's no ambiguity when several years down the line we're dealing with these sites.
I think that's a useful suggestion, Mr. Keogh.
We'll take that up. I mean, there's reference in the supporting text already to an up-to-date needs survey carried out with the council and the relevant parish council, which is along the same lines. But we'll take that away and see if there's any form of wording which can be added in the supporting text, not the policy. Sorry, just to pick up on other points that were raised by Mr. Keogh. 3 and 4. The rationale for including those is we understand that there are obviously other policies in the plan, but given this is a policy which is dealing specifically with exception sites, we thought it appropriate to include a little bit more detail there, given that if the site is being advanced as an exception to normal policies, there's a little bit more guidance within the policy itself as to what we'd be looking for. Therefore, criteria 3 and 4 were retained. Under the reasonable land values point, we don't think this deletion of that would be necessary to make the plan sound. There doesn't appear to be any dispute that a financial appraisal would be required, and it's inherent in that land values are going to be included in an appraisal of that nature. We see no objection in ensuring that the policy provides for reasonable land values to be included in that appraisal.
I mean, I must admit, I did wonder about this part of the policy, so I may as well air it now. What it seems to be saying is that if the site would not be viable as an exception site, so if it didn't contain purely affordable housing, there could be a situation where it could be cross-subsidised by an element of market housing.
Yes. I think the idea is that, I think under criterion 3, the requirement for a financial appraisal about the market housing component, requiring that market housing be shown to be essential to delivery of the scheme, is to ensure that there aren't other options within the provision of affordable housing that release greater viability. So you could have flexibility, for example, in the tenure of the affordable housing. There could be something in terms of phasing, depending on the site. So the idea behind that criterion is to put the applicant to proof to demonstrate that before dropping any potential affordable housing off the site and making it market, that you've done the financial work to demonstrate there aren't any other options of making it entirely affordable. I think that's really why criterion 3 is in there. Again, it goes back to the concept of this being an exception site. You're just putting the applicant to proof that it's a genuine exception site.
My question was perhaps going back a stage, and I was looking at, let's just check I'm looking at the right version of the PPF. Yes, I am, because you're basing it on 2021. Limited affordable housing for local community needs, but importantly, under policies set out in the development plan.
Yes.
So there's nothing in that says it has to be all affordable, because it leaves it to the development plan to work out how it might come about.
That's correct, but one notes that the purpose of it is limited affordable housing for local community needs. So what we're trying to do through the policy is to ensure that there's a balance between making sure it's a genuine exception site because it's affordable housing being delivered, but we're recognising the reality that because of the nature of these sites, there may be some exceptional circumstances where you need market housing to develop it, and we just want to control the circumstances in which that occurs. As you say, there's flexibility in the MPPF, which allows for local authorities to do that in their own way through the development plan. And we say this is the appropriate mechanism to achieve it.
Yeah. Thinking back to what we've discussed in previous hearings about how much of this sort of housing has come about over previous years and the reliance in the plan on windfalls. That's why my colleague and I were keen to ask about that.
Yes.
It could be argued, and I'm not saying, but it could be argued that what you've done in this policy is positively prepared because you're looking to lever in
Yes.
affordable housing on exception sites by making sure it's not just exception sites that can come forward with just affordable housing.
Yes, we recognise that there's a degree of pragmatism that's required, and that if a site is suitable for affordable housing, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in circumstances where you might need a limited amount of market accommodation. But as I say, the reason for that aspect of the policy is to make sure that the rationale behind it is not frankly sort of abused by market housing coming forward on what should properly be rural exception sites.
There's a danger that it just becomes like a normal market housing development.
Exactly.
With
and we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Sure. Mr. Pilcher?
Thank you, sir. I think quite often the proof of the pudding's in the eating, and those of us who are going to be here and around York for the next 4 decades obviously want to know that these policies can deliver. So immediately, as soon as you said, well, I want to know how it's going to work in practice, I think we do too as well, because if we managed to find a site that was good enough to meet the criteria 1, 2, 3 and 4, I think your first question is if it's that good, it probably ought to have been an allocation years ago. But if you manage to get something in those sort of urban fringe locations that's well suited in scale and form and character to the settlement that it's around, you're still going to have a process to go through, quite a difficult process in York, where we're going to have to sort of bring an application forwards. And I can quite understand that you can't just bring forward an application with its 49% market housing, 51, we've just hit a majority, etc. I think we could do with maybe more information to perhaps indicate how they see the balance, because the reality of infrastructure costs is maybe 5% market housing is probably not going to be enough to deal with the infrastructure costs that you've got in the modern age. But if we bring forward an application where it's 25%, I can market and 75% affordable, I could see you immediately have an issue where an officer or someone's opinions become, well, that's not reasonable, because it's just written as reasonable land values. And someone might say, well, if there's any land value, the landowner's going to get 200,000 quid for it, well, that's better than nothing, why not? But that same landowner, when we think of the practical implications, if they've got a piece of land that's an urban fringe piece of land, you know, it could well in the future have a much greater value. So the reality is if GB4 is going to actually have a positive impact on delivering affordable housing, and there are two ways of looking at it. You either say, well, we've created GB4 to comply with the old paragraph 89, which is very similar to the new 149, and we're just having it to make sure we've got a policy that's pretty similar to the national policy. Or you could look at it as an opportunity to try and address York's issue of affordable housing. Now, obviously, in the past, plenty have looked at it and said, well, we think we've identified social housing need at 573, and we're going to aim to deliver 221. Now, I think I've written in my submission that that would leave a very large amount of affordable housing still needed to be addressed. And this is potentially one of the few ways that you could try and do so. So they almost need to get the balance just right in terms of carrot and stick to encourage a landowner to be prepared to in this plan period, try to bring something forward rather than just wait until the 2030s and hope that a different policy or a different era sees a different sort of thing. So what I've written up something and I sent something in that I suspect Mr. Linus will scotch or disagree on, but my recommendation for GB4 is that even if you left points 1, 2, 3, 4 exactly as they were, that in the first bullet point, after majority of development must be for affordable housing, I would add all self-build and custom housing up to a set percent. Now, they might come out with a number that's relatively low, but the point is, there's an opportunity here to add some market value, some land value, some residual land value to these, what are exception sites, but probably still not unreasonable sites. They're not going to have an impact on the historic character of the city, or, you know, they're not flying a kite sites, they're reasonable sites. And I think if you don't have any sort of carrot, the proof of the pudding will be 0 houses delivered under GB4. And what I have written down as one of my points here is that for GB4 to be effective, and therefore effectively we go back to paragraph 182, examining local plans, it needs to be positively prepared, but it needs to be effective. And if that's going to be an effective policy, there are two ways of looking at it. You either think, well, it's effective because it just complies with the MPPF and it still stops development, or you look at it and say it's effective because it's helping to bring forward affordable housing in reasonable locations at a particularly high rate, which helps deal with our big gap between 221 and 573. So I'm saying that in its current format, it's not effective. And I would say that for the last 10 years at least, since we've had the 2012 MPPF, in reality, when it comes to determining applications, the 2005 draft plan carries very limited weight. So when we come to appeal decisions, people can say, well, the 2005 policy, it's very limited weight because it's really out of date. But the 2012, and maybe even the 2019 and 2021, when we're appealing decisions, they carried substantial weight. So I would say for the last 10 years, we've had paragraph 89 to lean on. And yet the proof of the pudding is that it hasn't been delivering housing. And I am one of those saddos that watches these meetings on YouTube. And I remember that phase 2, they covered the issue. And I think the council put forward an opinion that they delivered 12 units on GB4. Someone else's representation said they delivered none. But whatever it is, between 0 and 12, that's not a significant sum relative to the whole plan period and significantly boosting supply of housing. So if over the next 10 years, this only added 100 units, I would contest that it hasn't been an effective policy. And therefore, this is perhaps the opportunity to draft something that might help deal with 2 birds with one stone. So my second part of it is, after the 2012 framework is created, we end up with the 2015 Self-Build and Custom Housing Act, which I believe the plan and the local authority has an obligation to address in some way. And they would say they've addressed it by creating a register, I think from March to 2016. And names go onto that list of people who'd like to self-build or be part of a custom build scheme, and then they try to bring forwards things. Now, the reality of it is that the first time we ever made representations on this back in 2018 or 2019, I was using a number saying, oh, we've already got 300 on this list, and we're not going to deliver these based on this rate. We should be delivering for those 300 people within a 3-year time period. So that's quite a significant factor. And without going back to OANs, etc., we should just be aware that self-build is an issue. But more recently, I've had a good relationship with the council self-build officer, and he would be happy to put in writing that they have a list that is around 600 people now. And in the last 6 years, they've delivered 14 plots. So I would say that this is a bit of an area to watch, because it's an area where they are failing to deliver the right number of plots for the people who are on the list. The council may say, well, we've got some sort of policy somewhere and it's going to work itself out. But I think it probably isn't, and it's probably going to get worse. And when we come to 5-year reviews and so on, we're going to end up having to add back in policies to deal with shortfalls of self-build plots or custom housing and so on. But the opportunity here is that if we change this main modification, make a main modification to this bit to include a reference to self-build and custom housing, it gives the council and anyone bringing forward a GB4 site a little bit more land value, because a residual land value on a self-build plot is significantly more. I think the York's experience is they've received about 100,000 a plot when they're selling stuff at Lowfield Green. And it means that it's probably 3 times the value of an affordable housing plot. So from a practical point of view, if you had an element, whether that's 10%, 15%, 20%, on a GB4 exception site, you drive enough residual land value to be able to tempt a landowner to consider it. Because otherwise they're thinking, well, I'll just wait another 10 years and see what happens. So if we want to pick up some opportunities, this is one that they might be able to do. And I also make reference to this in the light of the wider national situation. And we look at the Colney Heath decision, which you're going to say, I know it very, very well, and you've read it. I've made reference to it in the thing. And the inspector there writes that very substantial weight is attached to just 10%. And I don't know if their situation is as bad as delivering 14 against 600 people, but I think our situation here in York is that we are fundamentally not delivering for those people, and that there's an opportunity to just make a slight modification to a GB4, or what will probably GB2, or however numbers pan out. But the point is, there's an opportunity to use a policy to give some hope, some scope, some residual value, and it may help them deliver on their self-build shortfalls, or their custom housing shortfalls as well. And it doesn't look unreasonable. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I am familiar with that decision. I've read it carefully, and because I mean it's been bandied about quite a bit, shall we say? Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. A number of different points there. I'll deal with what appeared to be at the beginning a plea for a percentage to be added in to the policy as far as non-affordable housing is concerned, and we would resist that too, sir, because obviously, as you'll be aware, a lot of this just depends on the circumstances of individual sites. As with any planning application which deals with affordable housing, there will be an assessment which needs to be carried out about what a site can bear viably, and we don't think it would be appropriate to have a specific percentage added into the policy by way of a permitted level of private or market housing, because it will have to be determined on a site-by-site basis. the criteria in the policy recognise that and provide an adequate test to achieve it. As for the reference to self-build, I bear in mind that if one goes back to the national policy, it is about limited affordable housing for local community needs. And that's the direct purpose of the policy. And the provision of market housing or any other form of housing on the site to support the provision of local affordable housing does not anticipate any particular provision of self-build housing, which is dealt with under a separate policy in the plan. I think the way it's being suggested, you start moving away from the purpose of this policy, which is to deal with exception sites for primarily affordable housing. Policy H4 in the plan seeks to promote self and custom house building in accordance with general policies, and we say that's the proper approach to self and custom build housing in the plan. And must bear in mind the very specific policy purpose of GB4, which is exception sites in the green belt, which is why it's related to affordable housing primarily.
If I may, the policy wouldn't, on my reading, rule out a scheme that had an element of affordable housing and then a couple of self-built plots or custom-built plots.
It wouldn't rule it out, but I think the way that Mr. Pilcher was putting it was to suggest that you needed to have something which positively encouraged self-build, and that we say this is not the policy to do it. We would assume that the policy wouldn't prevent self-build coming forward on any site, but obviously the primary purpose of the policy is to deal with affordable housing. We must be careful not to introduce wider building aspirations into what is actually quite a specific policy.
Thank you, Mr. Linus. I interrupted. Had you finished, or? Go ahead.
Joe Perkins from Banks Group. I would just like to say that we support the inclusion of the mechanism for including market housing suggested by the Council based on viability reasons, so we would therefore also support Mr Pilcher's comments. One thing that we were monitoring as a developer was a 100% affordable scheme on Boroughbridge Road, which was refused and dismissed for heritage reasons. I think that highlights the high bar against which exception sites are assessed in York, so additional flexibility in the exception site policy would be supported by Banks Group. I think this is all in the context of a chronic under-delivery of affordables in the York area. Like I said, we've seen 100% scheme refused for Greenbelt reasons. However, having said all this, the NPPF does not include wording relating to market housing for viability reasons on Greenbelt exception sites. So facilitating market housing through the policy wording on an exception site does suggest that insufficient housing allocations have been put forward by the Council and does potentially suggest a need for safeguarded land on which affordables could be delivered in the short term, which would serve the same purpose as exception sites. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pilcher.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I just wanted to come back to Mr. Linus and say I totally understand his position. I think if we don't ask, we won't get. And I think we need to be here to say that we're positively trying to provide the housing they need, and we're trying to do it. And if we have some sort of ways of trying to encourage landowners to deliver, then it may be an effective policy. It may be positive to try to go for some of these shortfalls on self-build and to go for the massive shortfalls on affordable housing. So I know, I totally see his point that when we come to 149F on the 2021, it is still not writing, despite the fact that the Self and Custom Build Housing Act has been, in a sense, since 2015, it's still not writing in the 2021 and self-build. So I get that point, and I hope that the next framework adds it. But until that time, I see his point, and he may want to keep GB4 separate from this. However, the problem we have in York is that policy H4, if we don't have anything that gives something an opportunity on Greenbelt, York is going to be 82% Greenbelt. So it means that it's so dominated by Greenbelt that we're just not going to be able to generate very special circumstances very often. And unless we all basically take risks and go for Colney Heath style decisions, we don't have the support of policy, and therefore we end up with this sort of combative situation where anyone who's trying to develop in York spends a lot of time and money appealing everything, which, as I said a few days ago, that it would be great if we could get a plan in place that means we don't spend loads of money on appeals. It would be good for the City of York, and it would be good for the, good for the developers as well. But I think self-build is potentially something where you can see some sort of community good in it, so it's not dissimilar to affordable housing. It may not be as high up the scale, but if there was some snippet in a policy, or if there was something in H4 or whatever that allowed self-build to have some sort of pull of against Greenbelt policy, then it would make a huge difference to us. So I totally see your point that in the 2021 it says in line with a local plan, and there's nothing for them, there's nothing against them saying we've proactively tried to deal with this, we're proactively trying to deal with our shortfalls, we've seen the Colney Heath decision, we don't want to have a load of stuff come in, so we're going to give a policy, we're going to put the 10% on it, and we can review it in 5 years' time and see if they've had a flood of applications. But we're still talking about sites where you might have 5% market just to provide something for roads and sewers, 10% for some self-build just to give the landowner a reason to sell, and then the rest of it is a big contribution towards affordable housing. So I would still stand by my point that Mr. Linus and the City of York may well have created a policy GB4 that is in accordance with the 2012 MPPF, and it may well still be in accordance with the 2021. But I can tell you, in its current format, the chances of it delivering a stack of much-needed affordable housing in reasonable Greenbelt locations is very low. It's just not likely to bring forwards loads, if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pilcher. Mr. Keogh, did you want to? No. Yeah, one point. And by all means, come back to what Mr. Pilcher said. What the framework says, 149F, is limited affordable housing for local community needs under policies set out in the development plan. So it doesn't define what limited means, as with a lot of words that are used in the framework. But unless you had a glossary that was so thick, you wouldn't be able to do that. So place a reasonable construction on limited. You haven't included the word limited in the policy. So is that, or am I missing that? You said that
I think the way that's been approached is that the reference to limited is intended to be a broad reflection of the fact that it is an exception site where the context of it being within the green belt and the requirement to provide local affordable housing needs test and to restrict the housing to those with a local connection will be the effective means of ensuring that any development that comes forward is limited in the broad sense. We can take away the point that if we want to ensure absolute consistency with the framework, there may be scope to add the word limited into policy GB4 just to make that consistency absolutely clear and make the expectation of the policy absolutely clear. I think the way it had been approached was that the controls within the policy were there to reflect the broad recognition that there would be a limited size of site coming forward under this policy, but we can have a look at that, sir.
I can see the point you make. If it is to meet identified local affordable housing need, as illustrated by a local housing needs assessment or something of that sort, you're not talking about sites of 100 dwellings.
Well, exactly.
And very unlikely.
Exactly. I mean, I think as well under the proposed GB1 as it stands, it talks about limited affordable housing for local community needs under policy. So there's already a reference to limited in there. If we need to carry that across into GB4, then I wouldn't see a problem with doing that.
Yeah, it may well be necessary for consistency, but because limited isn't well, it's a relative concept. So
yes, you need to work out how you're going to apply it, which is what the policy is at least starting to try to do. But there's always going to be an element of judgment on terms in the policy anyway. Of course. Yeah.
But it might be worth a thought.
We'll have a look at that. Thank you, sir.
Is there anything else on these policies, Mr. Pilcher?
Yeah, so I just wanted to just to sort of touch again on the issue that we've got one local authority, and I can understand that some local authorities have very large areas, and they might be saying, well, you can't just pop up a site based on the need that we have in Northumberland, whatever, a district, and then you're like, well, this village can't take 78 affordable houses, even though you could prove that the local authority might need it. So I can see that as an issue. But York is actually quite a relatively small area. And one of the issues we have in practical terms is that the green belt is generally outside of a city. Generally, some of it comes in, but it means that outer wards are the places where GB4 might apply, and yet it's the inner wards that actually have the greatest existing housing need. They have, chronic problems, and sometimes I go see my local York Central MP, and she will tell us how bad the problems are. And I think we might have an issue whereby the inner wards could say, oh, we've got this large amount of need, we can prove it, and this is why we end up with 573 and blah, blah, blah. But some of the outer wards might say, well, I've already got a house, and I don't want anything around here, and we don't have that problem around here because we're a lovely, suburban area. And we don't want people coming in from that ward, etc. So I can't see how a local authority can sort of say, you're from Holgate, so you're not getting a place in Coppenthorpe West Ward. You're talking about half a mile, and it may well be that we've got a problem here where when we actually police this thing, if sites were to come forwards in those locations, is that people are going to take a very, very parochial view and say, well, unless you can prove that you already live in this ward, on this street, in which case you've already got a house, that you don't deserve to be in this area. So not only in reality are we going to have the issue that Mr. Keogh's pointed out, that we're going to have to spend probably a large amount of money trying to prove that there's the need, we're then going to be faced with the difficulty of local politics saying, well, we don't need it in our ward, and that's not local enough just because if they need it in York Central, we're not bothered. And we then actually have close to nil residual land value, so we're trying to tempt a landowner to sell. We're spending loads of money trying to prove that there's need when we look at this plan and we know that there's need, that they've identified there's loads of need. I just don't think in reality it's going to lead to much if they are capable of enforcing it on a really local basis, rather than just saying, oh, well, the City of York has need, therefore we could put some of that need on the outside of a city because that's where GB sites are. So I think in reality it may well be that they've defined a policy and now they know that writing it the right way it won't deliver anything, which may well be what's wanted by the executive.
Mr. Linus, I mean, from my point of view, an exception site, my understanding, is meant to cater for local need, and it's generally rural. So you wouldn't be using need in York Central to justify an exception site out in the Greenbelt somewhere. But
Yes,
I may have that wrong.
Yes, and I mean, there's a number of other considerations, which is, first of all, sustainable patterns of development, and secondly, actually locating the need where it's been identified. From a house builder's perspective, I can understand that it might be quite useful to rely upon need in a different part of the city to justify building in one location, but you've got to actually understand the people who are supposed to be living in the properties. So if someone is in need in York Central, it's not necessarily going to assist them to be located somewhere in the rural area, particularly when, as the policy requires, you need to demonstrate the need in that local area and that local community. And that's entirely consistent with the overall thrust of policy. And just to pick up on what Mr. Pilcher said more generally, you'll be aware, sir, from the affordable housing note that went in July, EXCYC 107, we've looked at affordable housing supply, and we say that the policy is adequate to meet a proportion of affordable housing needs in the area, but we're not actually relying upon rural exception sites as part of our supply. So we see rural exception sites as a bonus to supply, and it's not correct to say that we're simply trying to frame the policy to minimise this happening. All we're doing is drafting a policy that's consistent with national policy objectives.
Yeah, finally, obviously we don't want to go around in circles all day, but I get his point, and I get your experience is that this is maybe a policy that would allow, a part of a village to keep people who've been in the village forever sort of thing, and it allows something to happen where it might not have happened, and the parish could be on board and all the rest of it. And that may well be how it works around a lot of the country. But I think Mr. Linus is just confirming that this is not to be used by developers as a way of delivering affordable housing on York's urban fringe, which to a great extent is a shame, because they've basically said we intend to deliver some of the affordable housing need. And I'm sure the framework has a desire to deliver all of the identified need as a minimum, rather than just to say, well, you can do as little as you can get away with. And Mr. Linus might not live in social rented, and he might not have the issue whereby he's desperate for a house in the City of York. But if you already live in the City of York, and you're currently, on a friend's sofa in Holgate, and you've been in that area for ages, you aren't going to turn down a social rent at 55% of the market rate another mile out on the edge of town. You're going to be thrilled to have finally got on there. And if you've been on a list for 10 years or 5 years or whatever, I don't think that being on the edge of York is, you're not totally disconnected from your community. I don't think that's true. I think the reality of it is, and many of the people who actually live in York know, is that a lot of the people, say for example, a lot of the people that we employ, is if they can't afford to live in York, they go live in other districts. And we see them queuing up the A19 from Selby District and from other places. And the reality is, if they are a York person who cannot afford to get on the ladder in York, they move out of a district. So having to hop a whole ward out to a fringe ward onto a site that is considered to be, green belt, I don't think that's a big distance to go and a big ask. And I think those people, if they were able to be engaged with the process, would be thrilled at the idea that the urban fringe of the city could deliver on some of the identified need. So I get the idea that a lot of this policy has been used over the last 10 years to help people keep communities together in rural environments, and as you say, it's a rural exception policy. But here in practicality, I get the impression in this room that it's not an intention for the City of York to see a significant increase in the supply of affordable housing using GB4 for its identified need.
I think that's probably right. I think generally the majority, without sort of putting words in the councillor's mouth, I think generally the intention is to provide most of the affordable housing through housing allocations and alongside the delivery of market housing. And when we talked at previous sessions about how much might come forward, and questions were asked about, well, what would the housing requirement need to be if we were going to meet 100% affordable needs? And yeah, it was easy to do the maths and work it out. But I think this policy is meant to be something else that delivers some affordable housing, but I don't think the council is seeing it as something that's going to make a serious dent in overall affordable housing need. I think that's intended to be met in another way. I think I've got that right.
Yes, that's why I referred to the note which you asked the council to prepare after the last phase. We're quite clear that the main sources of supply are intended to be from sources which aren't the rural exception sites. They haven't been identified as a separate element of the supply that's been included in the supply figures, although we've acknowledged that further supply will come forward from rural exception sites. It's confirmed in paragraph 6 of the note. There are other sources of supply that, such as delivery of 100% affordable housing schemes by registered providers, additional affordable housing delivered by the council through financial contributions that are secured from developments generally. So there will always be a source of affordable housing supply beyond the allocations that are set out in the plan and the supply figures that are included in the note. That doesn't mean we don't provide for these other sources of supply to come through in policy, even if we don't identify them in terms of the actual figures in the supply.
Is that, Mr. Linus, what we were talking about at phase 3, when we were talking about the concept of headroom?
I think it is. So I wasn't at those sessions, but I understand that the note EXCYC 107 was prepared in response to queries that you raised on clarification of the sources of supply, as well as the target that was being sought. And when we set out the supply figures, we made it clear what the sources were and confirmed that rural exception sites would be an additional source of supply, but not in the supply figures as calculated. And as you said, that reflects their status as exception sites.
Yeah, I think we've probably gone as far as we can on it. It is what it is. Otherwise, we'll go back to phase 1 and we'll be talking about, how many units you need to deliver with only 30% market rate, and then suddenly we're talking about 1,700 a year and all the rest of it. So
we did ask that specific question just to get an idea of what it would need to be and what the implications of that might be. Shall we put it like that? Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they want to say about GB1, GB4 or SS2 indeed? One thing you've done in SS2, I noticed, Mr. Linus, in your note that you put in, was amend the second paragraph to say greenbelt boundaries are shown on the proposals map.
Yes.
That answers one of my points, which there is a green belt, yes, because of the RSS. But yes, I wondered whether there was some mechanism needed in a policy that actually says this is where the green belt is. And yes, but effectively that does that, doesn't it?
Yes. I'm just, now that I look at it, I need to check whether we're calling it a proposals map or policies map. But either way, you're right.
Whichever one. Yeah, I always get it confused.
That's right, because we understand that there's a key diagram, but ultimately, bearing in mind what we heard at the sessions, where people will be scrutinising the boundaries to see whether or not they fall inside or out, in the natural course of events, you're going to be looking at the proposals map, and we just thought it more efficient for the policy just to take you straight there.
Agreed. And the other thing I wondered about SS2, and you said greenbelt boundaries are shown on the map.
Yes.
Because what the policy says at the moment is the general extent, but it's not the general extent anymore once you set the boundaries.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a potentially interesting debate in the sense that the words general extent in the policy are used to show that the green belt is up and down the country, and you don't want to propose any, if you're proposing any new green belt, that's where the difference lies. So it may not be that there is an inconsistency between having a general extent, which also has boundaries, but to avoid any possible confusion or debate in the future, it's possibly easier just to, for the purposes of the policy, to go straight to the word boundaries on the proposals map, whatever the key diagram might be showing, because ultimately it's the policies map which will be used.
Yes. Good. Okay. Is there anything else we need to cover this afternoon then?
So I was just very, very briefly on SS2. One thing that I put in my submission is that I thought they could potentially change the wording from degree of permanence, because obviously our intention is to set these to be permanent boundaries. And as soon as they write degree of permanence, they're encouraging me to come back at the 5-year review, the 10-year review, in the next one in the 2030s, the 2040s, and I obviously will be suggesting chipping away at them forever. If they wrote permanence and they kept in mind this well beyond the plan period, then I think that might be more consistent with national policy.
We'll take that away. I mean, deleting the words a degree of to simply say permanence, I don't think there'd be a problem with that. It's consistent with our case because we say they're permanent boundaries, so we'll take that away too, sir.
That's a useful suggestion, Mr. Pilger. Thank you. Good. Well, unless there's anything else, then I'm going to close this afternoon's hearing. We're back tomorrow at 9:30. I must admit, a 5-day week is a little different for us anyway. It's not that we don't work for 5 days, it's just that we don't usually sit on Mondays. No, so, exactly. Yes. Matter 4, placemaking, design, heritage and culture, and then policies in the morning, and then we resume again at 2 o'clock. So,
yes, thank you, sir.
I'll see some of you tomorrow, but if not, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You've been most helpful.